Well, hello everyone. I'm Dan Wood from Draft to Digital, and I'm really excited today. I have my friend Eliana West, who I got to know at the Emerald City Writers Conference a few years ago. Uh, she ran a workshop on diversity for writers, and which is a great workshop. I attended it and learned a lot. And then I think it was the following year, maybe, when you ran the Emerald City Writers Conference.
I
Uh,
did, yeah.
and really had that focus on diversity. I wanted to have you on just because I want to talk about all of that. As I mentioned to you when we were chatting before the show, it's always important to talk about diversity, and yet, like right now, I feel like it's something that we're all thinking about, maybe more so than we have before. And so, really excited to have you on. Wanted to talk a little bit, first of all, just as far as your experience as a writer. If correct me if I'm wrong, but you have your first book coming out soon with as a Thule Publishing.
I do. I have my
Excellent.
debut coming out with Thule in August 21st, or
Excellent.
August 25th, excuse me. And I just signed a contract for the second book in the series. So it's both really, really exciting, and I'm scared witless.
I know, right? I'm excited because you'd been talking to me a little bit about it for the last few years, and you'd been working on a book and working on a book. It's exciting to be kind of getting into the end zone and being almost there with. But like I looked it up, I love the cover, saw the pre-order on
Thank
Amazon.
you.
Excited about that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah. And it's interesting you brought up the cover, because that was actually an interesting process of trying to find the right cover image. And as a writer who writes interracial romance,
Mm-hmm.
it really became very apparent. And I just want to say that Thule has been so incredibly wonderful and supportive. But I think it was really gave them some insight in just how challenging it is if you're writing interracial or LGBTQ romance or any kind of diverse romance. Finding images is just
Yes.
a whole other challenge. We just
There's a
don't
lack of
have
stock
access.
photos. Yeah.
Yeah.
That can impact stuff for making your covers. It also impacts your marketing when it's hard to find those models.
I'm going through it right now. I'm trying to find images, and I don't have access to the same number. I don't have the same access to choice, and often, so that costs me additional time.
Yes.
It might cost me, actually having to having a custom photograph done, which is additional time and money. So it really speaks to that we are not at a level playing field. How we can't market our books as effectively
Yeah.
as other writers, because we have to jump over these additional hurdles.
Yeah. It really, like, there are things people don't see behind the scenes that really do impact your ability to succeed and market your book. I want to talk a little bit within publishing, and in general, I'm this is mostly talking about traditional publishing, but it does carry over into the indie world. I think the last survey I saw, which Lee and Lowe does a survey on diversity in the people who work in publishing. It's about 76% are white people. There's several reasons why that is. Some of it has to do with a lot of entry level jobs into publishing are unpaid internships.
Yeah.
And there's only so many people that can afford to live in cities like New York City, London, Toronto, where publishing is based, and not get paid for a year or more.
Absolutely. And it really speaks to the larger issue of economic disparity, obviously. And that's something that publishing is going to have to, traditional publishing houses, if they really want to affect change, if they're really speaking to making systematic changes, that's something that they're going to have to address.
I agree 100%.
Yeah.
How would you say, how would you say that's affected both what you've seen in your career as an author and in your work, volunteering and then running the Emerald City Writer Conference?
I think it's really interesting. There are some Dogwhistle words, and the number one word I would say is unrelatable.
Yeah. Yeah.
You hear, well, it's unrelatable. Well, what does that really mean? I recently had an experience with a review where the reviewer was uncomfortable. Well, what does that mean when you say you're uncomfortable? And I think publishing, and that includes editors, agents, and reviewers. You're going to have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I did with when I ran Emerald City, when I was chair of the conference that year, was I was very direct with every single editor and agent that we invited to the conference, who were coming to take pitches, that we asked them to be committed to accepting pitches from all LGBTQ, interracial, within romance. Obviously, it was a romance writers conference, but you had to be open to accepting pitches from the full spectrum of the romance genre,
which is excellent. The world needs all these stories. People want to read things they can identify with, and when most of the books coming out are just the same basic elements, I think of the Hallmark movies, and I'm not attacking anyone that likes Hallmark movies, but they are very homogenous, and they have a very a certain pattern to them.
Well, they have a very specific view of a world that,
yes,
in my opinion, does not exist.
Yeah.
And I think you probably heard me tell this story. And I've told it many, many times because I think it speaks to, obviously we want new and young readers. Yes. We want our industry to continue to grow. And I tell the story of my daughter watching, there was a reboot of the show Gilmore Girls a couple years ago, or a few years ago. And it's not a show that I watch, but my daughter happened to be home, and she was on our couch watching it, and I kept coming in and out of the room, and she was still watching it. And I finally said, "What is this show about?" And my daughter, who's biracial, said, "Oh, small town white girls doing small town white girl things, but it doesn't really matter because it's not real anyway." Right. And that was the part. If she is our future reader, and she wants to see stories with people who look like her, with worlds that look like her world, where she has friends of all different abilities, sexual orientation, and ethnic and backgrounds, religious backgrounds. We can't have the Friends coffee shop, right?
Exactly. I think Friends is a great example of the lack of diversity in New York City, which is one of the most diverse cities in the world. And, it's difficult to judge something this far out of context. Like, I don't think any people said, well, I mean, at least the actors and Friends were consciously making those decisions. But now we look back at it and it just looks really weird because it's so just overwhelmingly white. Mm-hmm. I wanted to back up a little bit. You mentioned the dog whistle terms, and would you explain what that means? Because we do have people watching all over the world. And so I figure there's probably some people that just aren't familiar with that term.
Sure. So a dog whistle word or dog whistle term is a term that it's sort of code switch. Do you know what code, when it's speaking in code is how I look at it. And obviously I should have probably looked up the Merriam-Webster definition before we came on, but it is a way to excuse what you really mean.
Yes.
That makes sense.
To kind of have if someone does question, it's like, oh, well, you're just reading into that. But
right.
In general, it really does mean that thing.
Push it away in the closet without actually, it's a way to say, well, this just makes me uncomfortable, without actually having to really dig deep and say, well, why does it make you uncomfortable? Right. Specifically, what about this makes you uncomfortable? And what it does is that allows that person to, it also is a way to shut down the conversation.
Yeah.
Because when someone says, oh, that makes me uncomfortable, then we tend to not want to make them uncomfortable. So we back off.
Yeah.
Right. It's human nature.
I think I was raised in such a way. I don't know if this is, my family being somewhat Southern Midwestern. Yeah, I don't like making people uncomfortable. Yeah, like it took me a while to get to sleep last night thinking, I know having this conversation might be uncomfortable for some people, and worrying that I might misspeak and say something offensive. And we need to have these conversations. Like, being uncomfortable is not the worst thing in the world, and it's the way things change.
Right.
Before the broadcast, we were talking about these having conversations, having dialogues. Social media, I think a lot of us are trying to have these dialogues on social media, but you lose out on some of the context without having the nonverbal, without hearing the tone. A lot of times we can be saying very hurtful things and not necessarily meaning it, and then someone else can jump on us for saying something hurtful. All of that is an awkward segue into, I'm so excited. You founded a group years ago called Writers for Diversity, which is a Facebook group to let people ask these questions and ask uncomfortable questions and discuss and talk. Would you speak a little bit to that? Sure.
I had friends coming up to me individually, sort of, and I could see them physically walking up to me like sheepishly and saying, "Can I ask you a question?" And it would more often or not be about writing a minority character. And I just thought, well, maybe if I started this group, Facebook group, there would be a place where if people couldn't see me one-on-one, if they had a question, they could like post a question. And I thought like 12 of my friends would join, and it would just be this little thing. And 3 years later, we're over 850 members, and it's just amazing. And what I learned is that people wanted a safe space. People have questions. They want to have these conversations, but there needs to be a space where nobody is going to say, "I can't believe you asked that question. How dare you? I'm so offended."
Yeah.
And so I sort of started talking about thoughtful and respectful dialogue, because a discussion, the definition, or at least definitions that I've read, is this idea that you have a discussion because you're going to win the argument. Mm-hmm. A dialogue is about being open to new ideas, and it's not about making your point and winning your argument. And I think that so much of social media has become this desire to have this mic drop, like Obama talked about. You have this mic drop moment, and look at me, and I'm so woke, and you make this comment and then you walk away. Yeah. And a dialogue is being in that moment of staying beyond "this makes me uncomfortable" to really have the conversation, to really dig deep about learning that we all have bias. We all have unconscious bias. We have all fallen into tropes and stereotypes that are hurtful and dangerous, and you don't know unless you have a place to learn and to ask these questions. And I've seen there are a couple of members that I've seen just have this like amazing transformation of their awareness and this willingness to learn and grow, but you have to give them space. And I constantly quote, I had the privilege to see Stacey Abrams speak last year.
Excellent.
And she said, perfection is impossible, but space to grow is always possible. And if we demand perfection at the beginning of the conversation, then we don't leave room for people to make mistakes, to ask questions, and to grow.
Yeah.
So I don't believe in teaching about diversity by shaming and browbeating. Mm-hmm. And I refuse to do it. So.
I loved your approach. One of the things that stuck out to me in the first workshop I heard you do, you had a worksheet and you talked about describing skin color, mm-hmm. And descriptions of people of color and minority. Would you talk a little bit about that? Because I think a lot of writers don't realize they are making some choices that might be offensive to other people.
Sure. I mean, I think I want to start by saying that language is always evolving. Yeah. And terms that were once acceptable are not now. And terms that we're using now, 5-10 years from now, people may be looking back and saying, oh my God, I can't believe they used that. So I currently am starting to see that shift with African American.
Yes.
We can talk about that as well. But, it used to be acceptable to use descriptors that sort of fetishized and promoted exotic images, but were also commodities. Mm-hmm. So cocoa, chocolate, mocha, and some people still want to use those terms, and that is perfectly acceptable. But I think more and more you're seeing the trend to be to move away from that, because to describe someone whose ancestors were sold as a commodity with a commodity is a little yucky.
Yes.
It's squishy, and so I don't know if you saw the new Crayola skin tone color pack.
I saw your post on that just recently.
Yeah, and I thought what they did was brilliant, where they used almond as the base, and then it was light almond, dark almond, golden almonds, and so. In my workshop, I talk about I use sort of the Bob Ross, the joy of painting. Yeah. But it's perfectly okay to use you don't need to be fancy. White, black, brown are fine, but then you can start layering in, all those colors that Bob Ross used in his palette, as far as like golden brown, light golden brown,
and you make your writing so much better. Like those paintings, if you were just using red, blue, and green, you'd have a boring painting. But when you have like the different shades, when you add in and when you start combining those descriptors, but I personally don't. I have been some of the worst pickup lines I've ever had back when I was single were, chocolate princess, and I that did not ever work with me. And I don't think, again, these days with our younger and readers, that does not go over well. Yeah. Along those lines, earlier you mentioned the tropes that have become commonplace, or have maybe always been commonplace, that promote stereotypes. And so would you talk about a couple of those?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Let's, we can talk about the wise Asian, the Mr. Miyagi stereotype, the one I've been talking about quite a bit, and obviously with the events happening over the last 2 weeks, is what's known as the magical Negro trope. It's a term that was coined by Spike Lee in a speech to, Yale. I believe it was Yale. I may be wrong on that. But it's sort of the Legend of Bagger Vance character, if you will, this man who comes out of the mist, and he teaches Matt Damon how to play amazing golf. And then he disappears into the mist so that Matt Damon can be the hero. And he has no backstory. He has no storyline. He is not a fully fledged person, but he has these magical abilities. And the problem is that these tropes have been around for decades. And what happens with a stereotype is that sometimes a stereotype morphs into truth. Mm-hmm. And so several years ago, Emory University did a study, and they interviewed young resident doctors. And it is horrifying, some of the things that they actually said they believed, like Black people have thicker skin. We have a higher tolerance to pain. And so when you put these stereotypes into your work, you are perpetuating the greater stereotype. And what I wrote about is when you see these images of a Black man and there are, 10 police officers holding him down, that comes from that stereotype that has become an unconscious bias of Black men have super strength.
Yeah.
That they have all these things. So, and that's why it's so important to be aware of and we do it unintentionally, but again, it's because the stereotypes have become unconscious bias and truth.
We've been pushed those ideas for a long time through movies, through books, through television.
Movies, television, we're bombarded by it constantly. Yeah. And so it's really important to be aware of that.
Yeah. I think I've seen it in in the idea that Native Americans have some special ability to track or hunt.
Exactly.
It really makes no sense. And yet we perpetuated it for decades.
Right. Even the portrayal of someone who is disabled as being tragically stoic.
Yeah.
They're somehow not allowed to be happy people. And sometimes it's so subtle and it's so insidious. You really have to, I don't always catch it. Yeah. And, but it's amazing. It's amazing how it worms its way into.
And I think it lessens your overall writing. A lot of times you can reduce someone to a sidekick role with very little personality, where you have the sassy person of color that's the best friend. Mm-hmm. You have the LGBTQ person that's just kind of zany and you can do so much more with those characters, making them real people.
Absolutely.
And not just reducing them to a stereotype.
And not just reducing them to a stereotype, 100%. And just to kind of piggyback on that, and if you're not comfortable with writing a diverse character, there are other ways to add diversity into your worlds, simply by just describing what their neighborhood looks like, what their one of the exercises I give in my classes, next time you're at the grocery store, pay attention to who's working at the grocery store, who's shopping at the grocery store, what are they buying, what are they putting in their cart. Diversity is everywhere. We live in a diverse world, in a diverse society. Again, if you were to describe your coffee shop, it would not look like the Friends coffee shop, right? Yeah. There's all sorts of people that are going to be there.
I know for me, growing up in a small town in Oklahoma, there wasn't a lot of diversity. I can't think of anyone who is openly LGBTQ. When I moved to New York City, I was college years. I had dropped out of college by that point. I was amazed. Like it changed my worldview, just being exposed to different things.
Right.
it made me more conscious, and we talked earlier about unconscious bias. Like you don't know sometimes. With that, when people come to your group, they tend to know, hey, maybe I'm making a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
For other people, would you talk about sensitivity readers? And something that's
Mm.
kind of caught on in the industry is, if you are tackling diversity, and you should be, maybe it's good to have someone who knows some of these things to read over your book and give you some feedback.
Mm-hmm. Sensitivity readers are a really interesting subject, and I have to say that my viewpoint on sensitivity readers has evolved. And in part, it came through a conversation that I had with the author Jamie Ford.
Okay.
And Jamie made an excellent point that sort of was one of those like aha light bulb moments for me. He does not use a sensitivity reader. And the reason he doesn't is because his publisher has one sensitivity reader for Asian characters. And that one sensitivity reader like feels that there's only like one way to be Chinese, right? And as we know, ethnicities, we are not a mono. I identify as, I am biracial. I identify as biracial and Black.
Mm-hmm.
We are not a monolith, right? There are many facets. So the problem with sensitivity readers, it's not a problem. Let me correct that. What you need to be aware of if you choose to use a sensitivity reader is that sensitivity reader may feel that there's only one, they are going to project their narrative and their experience. So what I have really begun encouraging people to do is you can use a sensitivity reader, but make sure that your beta readers are a diverse group.
Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah.
You must diversify your beta readers. I think you have a much better chance of being successful in catching issues or making significant edits if you have a diverse group of beta readers.
Yeah. I want to remind people we've got a few minutes before we're going to start taking questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please post them in the comments, and we'll start working through some of those, because I think we got a wealth of information here. Want to talk? You'd sent me the article. We touched on a little bit earlier. The article, you had a review where the reviewer was uncomfortable. What were your feelings about that? Because
it was frustrating, and it's not something that it's really hard to speak out about, because I don't want to be like, oh, right, I got a bad review, and it's not about that. It's about the larger problem of reviews. And the very first contest I ever entered, I got a low score from a judge, and the comment was, this would never happen. And what it was my inciting incident was a Black woman walking into a high-end department store and asking to see a handbag, and the sales associate refusing to show it to her. Now, that's actually happened to me. So, but again, that judge was.
I think Eliana might be cutting out a little bit on me here. Can you hear me? Well, sorry about that. The hard part about doing these live is sometimes we do have some internet issues. Hopefully it's not on my end. If you could, any questions, start queuing them up, and as soon as she gets back, we'll start hitting on those. start sharing some of the comments from the audience. Danielle says, I need to replay this. Missed a few minutes. Love it. Thank you so much, Danielle. Like, this was something I've really been wanting to do for a while, and we had scheduled it, and I'm glad that it finally is happening. Eliana just messaged me that she's having a technical problem, but she is working on getting back on. So thank you so much for that, Danielle. And Carmen, hi, Carmen. I'm really sad. I didn't get to go to the Emerald City Writers Conference last year, so I didn't get to see some of my friends there in Seattle. But it's good to see that you're here. I hope you're doing well. I got a comment from Jimmy, greeting from Dallas. Thank you for doing the interview, and thank you so much for tuning in. It's important to bring people from all different backgrounds. We have tried from the very beginning not to just include indie authors. We want to make sure we have people that are traditional. We want to have people that were indie, and more and more, what we're seeing is common is hybrid authors, to where you might start your career as an indie, but you have options to work with traditional publishers. Just knowing the pros and cons of that is key, I think, and just making sure you're aware. What we see a lot more often is we've seen a lot of authors that have been at this for years that have been traditional because it was the only path to get published for so long, and now they are going indie because they can publish more. They're bringing back works that stopped selling for whatever reason and then weren't on the bookshelves at the different stores. And so you can bring new life to intellectual property you wrote years ago and sell those books. Some of them will update the book a little bit. Some of them will just release them as is. So it's something that's always possible. It looks like Eliana's starting to come back on. Hopefully it'll be connected soon. Hello.
I'm so sorry.
No worries. It's definitely one of the scary parts about doing it live is that's very possible, is to have technical difficulties.
Oh my gosh. Pro tip, everyone, check your laptop battery before you play. Pro tip. Just saying.
I had my external light that I have to kind of even out the light in my room. I had it go out during the middle of one of a Zoom call because I didn't think about the battery.
Hey, Lisa, we're not the guy who left the camera on when he went to have some alone time. I don't know if you saw that.
I've seen all kinds of crazy videos, like one where a woman's on a Zoom call and started heading to the bathroom and just
let's not do that.
Yeah. Okay,
I apologize.
No worries. So you're discussing how someone was uncomfortable because they thought a situation wouldn't happen.
Right, and I think that illustrates the need for. I'm going to assume that reviewer was white.
Yeah,
and that sort of segues into privilege, but to sort of be and. Listen, my husband is white, and when we first started dating, there would be times when I would say, okay, this is going to happen. And he would be like, that's never going to happen. And then it would happen. And he was like, oh, wow, that person, you really did just like that salesperson really did just completely ignore you. Often, not often, but sometimes when we go out for dinner together, the server will bring us separate checks. So what I'm trying to do is illustrate the need for we need reviewers from different backgrounds. We need diversity in reviewers. We need diversity in, we need better training for, if you're going to run a contest, making sure that the judging isn't biased and the judging pool is diverse enough so that you have people who will recognize diversity of experience.
It's something I think you have to make a conscious effort, because of the that unconscious bias. It just happens. They've done the studies that show that if you have a resume, like an equal resume, and the more white the name sounds, the more likely, like by an incredible margin, you are to be hired.
Right. No, absolutely. And again, people make assumptions all the time.
Yeah.
You really have to train, and it's something we all have to work on. And it's not something that you master and then you're the master of it and you don't have to work on it anymore. This is something that we all have to work on. I don't care what your background is. I don't care. Nobody's exempt from this. As human beings, we all have to work on this. And it's something that you constantly have to practice. You have to practice it all the time.
And just pay attention to your diverse friends, your friends that are different than you, their experience, and listen.
Listening is key. And I was just talking to a friend of mine about this, about the difference between, are you, this isn't the most elegant way to put it, but are you listening or are you just keeping your mouth shut?
Yeah.
Keeping your mouth shut is your brain is racing and thinking of all the things of how this compares to you or interrupting, going, oh, that happened to me. Or are you actually listening?
Yeah.
And the other thing I talk about is, it's you like you and I were talking before we came on, and like, how's your day going? Oh, fine. I, went to the grocery store, I did this and that. You might ask me, and I might say, oh, well, I got followed by the store security, and he searched my bag before I left the store or whatever. I'm not saying this to like shame you or making you feel bad. I'm just sharing my experience. Mm-hmm. And it just so happens that my experience might make you uncomfortable. And it's my daily interactions. I mean, I would say that on any given day, granted right now, because I'm locked away at home, it's much less, but when I'm out in public, I would say I probably experience 3 to 5 microaggressions every day.
Yeah.
Every day.
I think I was privileged to have, my mom was adopted off the Navajo reservation. So she was full-blood Navajo. I ended up, my dad was of Irish descent, so I ended up looking like him. But I remember as a child, people treating my mom differently than they treated me and my grandmother. Like, I wasn't related to my grandmother. She had adopted my mom, but I looked more like her just by skin tone. Mm-hmm. People would come up and ask her whose child that was. Like things, they just make assumptions. And not everyone has that experience. And so they just kind of assume that the world works the way for everyone that it does for them. And that is just not the case.
It is not the case at all.
I have a really important one that I want to make sure we get to from Christine. I've heard some proponents of own voices put forward the notion that unless an author is like their character, LGBTQ, certain ethnicity, etc., that they should not write these characters. What is your response to that?
Wow, right out of the gate, we're going to go to the big, we're just going to go there.
I figured that one would come up, but I think it's an important one.
No, it is an incredibly important question. I have a viewpoint on own voices that may be a little different. I think own voices is important. I think the original idea and concept of own voices has been somewhat co-opted. The idea behind own voices was to in my opinion, disclaimer, I'm speaking from my viewpoint, was to promote authors of color, to make sure that authors of color have the same access to editors, agents, and publishers that that all writers have, but in particular that that let's take To Kill a Mockingbird. Mm-hmm. if there were two exact versions of To Kill a Mockingbird, but one was written by a Black writer who had that experience, that is the book that should be published, right? I mean, that is the story that needs to be told. Now, what has happened is it's become that concept has sort of morphed into this idea that only Black writers can write Black characters. Only LGBTQ writers can write LGBTQ characters. And for me personally, okay, so I'm half Black, half white, I'm Jewish, and I have dyslexia. Am I only allowed to write half Black, half white, Jewish, dyslexic characters? It doesn't really work. Yeah. And we are writers. We write fiction, and we are writing the stories about the world around us. Again, we are writing what that coffee shop looks like today. So of course we are going to write these characters. Now, should you write a story as if you are a gay Black man? Probably. That's something that you really need to think about. Why do you feel that you need to tell that story?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think being a reader has been shown to make you have more empathy. And I think to be a writer at all, you've got to have a lot of empathy. Like, you're putting yourself into other people's heads, and you can't be everything you write. So you're going to be writing about other things that are foreign to you. But the better you understand them, the better your works are going to be.
Right.
I think of the recent controversy in publishing with the book about the Latino experience in America. Mm-hmm. That was by a white woman. It was like really pushed, a lot of marketing push. I don't think this is on the author, but the publisher portrayed it as she was married to an immigrant. Right. Hence her understanding, but it was not like a Latino immigrant. Like, it was just kind of controversial, and it should be. And
I'm glad you pointed out that some of the onus was on the publisher for the way they promoted that book. They tried to take advantage of saying, "Oh, look, we've got this," and it's sort of like Barnes and Noble when they were going to do these.
Oh my gosh, yes, the covers of classics.
The cover of classics, like.
And they change the character's color. It's kind of like when you hear about whitewashing in Hollywood, where they just willy-nilly make a change.
Right. You have to do the work. You have to think it through. Just do the work. Don't try to just. You can't just phone it in. When it comes to talking and writing about diverse characters and diverse, you can't. It shows in the work.
It really does. And I want to make sure and share this for everyone. It's where to find you at is elianawest.com.
Yeah.
And the group, and I think especially for that last question of own voices, it's the example of some of the kind of questions that they get in that group all the time. And it's Writers for Diversity, because it is a very important question, because I think a lot of people are just scared now. Yeah. And we do, there are reasons to be scared when we have such a mob culture on social media. But there are safe places you can find to talk about some of these issues, and make sure, if you think maybe I'm stepping on someone's toes, there are people you can talk to. And it's
I'm putting my headphones in because the gardeners apparently just showed. This is great.
So it's so important to ask those questions and not to be scared. I mean, and that's something.
Well, listen, it is scary, and I get that. But again, we need safe spaces to have these conversations, because what I hate seeing is someone who is asking a legitimate question. They're trying to learn and grow, and it breaks my heart every time I see that person get pummeled on social media, or just really shamed and beat down, because Instead of building an ally, you're creating, you've got this person cowering in fear, and that's not helping. So let's engage in thoughtful, respectful dialogue. Let's recognize that people are learning, and maybe show a little bit of patience and empathy. I was rereading an article about, they've actually done studies that show that kindness and empathy are two of the biggest factors in winning if you're giving a persuasive argument, or if you're trying to have someone see your point of view, is that if you approach that person with kindness and empathy, you have a better chance of helping them.
It physically hurts people, like causes mental anguish to change your mind, your opinion. And if you're just attacking them, it's more of a conciliatory. You need to help them make it through.
Well, and I think recognizing, and I'm specifically I'm going to speak to white people. It's not the right term. But you might think you're woke, and you are at this place of your personal place of understanding. And so you really want to go out there and get everybody else to get to where you're at. But understand that everybody learns at their own pace, and everybody comes to this at their own pace. And especially in conversations I find about race, or dealing with someone who has racist points of view, it's like dealing with someone who maybe is, so my daughter made the incredibly brave choice to do inpatient treatment for depression and anxiety this last year. And now that she's done it, she keeps saying, oh my gosh, why didn't I do this sooner? Why didn't I do this sooner? And I keep saying, you know what, because you weren't ready. And you have to think of that person that you're dealing with in the same way. Until they're ready, they're not going to listen, and they're not going to engage in the conversation with you. So when they do come to you and they're ready, you don't want to beat that person down. You don't want to be like, oh my God, you're so offensive. You want to go, great, let's engage in thoughtful, respectful dialogue. I'm going to say it again. Let's have this conversation. Or I would suggest everyone that's new to this conversation, we read White Fragility to start with, Robin DiAngelo's book, so that everything else you layer on top of that, you understand that you might be coming from a place of feeling defensive and uncomfortable, and it will help you be more open and receptive to going on, and then reading. So you think you want to talk about race, or so look what I have on my bookshelf, How to Be Black, all these other books that are,
Yeah. It's, I know early on we started doing this because we were looking to fill the hole that was left in our schedules and in our marketing, from not going to conferences. A lot of our efforts have been around conferences. We started by inviting our industry friends and the authors that we hear speak at conferences all the time. And it was predominantly white and male. And one of our employees pointed out, hey, you haven't had any women on yet. Well, oh my gosh. Wasn't intention, our intention. It just was, if you just pull from the normal sources, you've got that bias has led it to be where a lot of the conferences have white male speakers. Again, we started working on that, and then also just realized we have not had really any diversity to it. It's still been we've had female, but not people of color, and so even people who are trying make mistakes sometimes, and so.
Perfection is impossible, but space to grow. You've got to leave that space to grow.
Yeah.
If you're growing, if you're trying, I'm not going to beat up on you. If I'm not going to beat up on anybody that I see making. I'm not going to beat up on anybody anyway, but I'm not going to beat up on anybody who's making a genuine effort.
Yeah.
So, are there any other questions? I feel so bad because
Oh, no worry. There was a couple other comments, but it really got to most of the questions. We are kind of we're a little bit over time. I want to thank you so much for being on, having a conversation. We'll have to do it again because I think there has been a lot of questions, and it's something we're all works in progress. And so
100%. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm still blown away by the response to the group, and really honored that I get to create this space and try to do this work, and hopefully we're making a difference.
I think it's wonderful that you do, because it's a lot of work, and it does kind of there are people that don't like it at times, and so
yeah, that's true.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will talk to you later.
Okay.